Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I'm Laurent Macquart. As you can see, today we are in a slightly different setting because I'm at my grandmother's house in the north of France. I arrived here with my mother just a couple of hours ago. It's Monday evening when I'm filming this. I wanted initially to film this video this morning when I was still in the Netherlands and I could sit in front of my bookcases and didn't have to bring all of the books that I've read to France. But there wasn't time to do that, so I have just taken the three physical books that I've read the past 2 weeks, because I wasn't there last week, with me. We were by car, so it didn't matter anyway, and I'm going to talk to you about the 5 books in total that I've read in the past 2 weeks. 3 of them are initially written in Dutch, so I'm going to start with the English ones. First, the first book that I want to talk about is The Marvels by Brian Selznick. This book is in 2 parts. The first is a graphical novel in this style. Gray, black, white drawings, and it's starting to rain. No, it's not starting to rain, just raindrops coming from the trees. I'm fine. Anyway, no text, well, no dialogue. There is text sometimes in journal entries or like this, newspaper articles. And the first part of the book, that is a graphic novel, is about the Marvel family, who are theater folk, and we follow them through a couple of generations. And then the second part of the book is written as a normal book, and it is about young Joseph, and Joseph walks away from the boarding school where his parents left him because they travel all over the world and he's not perfect, so they decided they didn't want him at. No, that's an exaggeration. But they left him at a boarding school, and he runs away to find his uncle, who lives in London and who he has never met. And his uncle, Albert Nightingale, lives in this very old house, and all of the rooms are decorated in a style of England a couple of decades before that. And the uncle is not happy that Joseph has arrived, and he's very strict and he doesn't want things to change. And of course the arrival of Joseph changed that, and Joseph discovers the Marvels and tries to learn more about them, and the 2 stories start to intermingle. It's a wonderful book. It's very atmospheric, especially because you start with these wonderful drawings that are full of emotion. And I can't show you too much because otherwise you might pick up on things. Well, no, it's not that clear. The characters are kind and warm-hearted, and it's rather a quick read because even the text part is very easy to read, and there's a lot of blank spaces. If you can get your hand on this, read it at the library. I would highly recommend it because it's rather heartwarming and well done, actually, the ways the stories mix. The Marvels. Then I just finished an audiobook called The Boat Runner by Devin Murphy, and it's historical fiction and a coming-of-age story set in the Second World War. Now, there are many books set in the Second World War, and sometimes I feel I shouldn't be reading so much of them because even though it's a very big event, it's one thing that happened in history. And there are so many wars and so many revolutions and so many ways of life and so many different countries. Why not learn about those? But then I come across a book like this one, like The Boat Runner, that gives me a whole other perspective, and that makes me realize that having this one humongous event that is still rather close by, and that because it's close by and because it's partly set also in Europe, that I know it's still sort of relatable. And with this book I got yet another view on things. I got yet another perspective, and so it made me appreciate how, even if it is the same event, well, not event is not the right word, the same period, and centered around the same horrors, you still learn more. You deepen your horizon. Instead of when you learn about another country, you broaden it. And it also, therefore, because you deepen your knowledge on this one thing, it also makes me at least appreciate, when I'm reading about something else that I don't know anything about, how many perspectives there are to whatever that is. So I was really happy to have read this book, even though when it started I was, oh wait, this is another World War II. I know where this is going. Anyway, what's it about? It's about a Dutch boy. Didn't know this was set in the Netherlands, by the way. Dutch boy, Jacob, he is 14, I think, 16 maybe when the book starts, and he lives in the north of the Netherlands in a small village, and, well, small village, no, not necessarily, Delfzijl city, and his father owns the factory where nearly all the people in the city work, so they're sort of wealthy, and his father wants, because that city is next to Germany, he has warm contacts with Germans, and to ensure that those contacts stay good, and that some Germans, I think it's Volkswagen, that he wants to buy his light bulbs. He, before the Second World War starts, sends his two sons, so Jacob and Edwin, the other brother, to a Hitler Youth camp, and there the boys are boys, and they're, I mean, we see them being slightly indoctrinated, but you see boys being boys on a summer camp. And later, the year afterwards, the father and the two sons go to Rotterdam at the beginning of May in 1939. So, knowing history, droplets. Okay. Knowing history, you kind of know you shouldn't be in Rotterdam at the beginning of May that year. So, as expected, the city is bombed. And what also happens is that the Dutch government, there's rain on my computer, little droplets. The Dutch government also decides to flood Rotterdam, and because of that, Edwin, Jacob's brother, goes missing, and Jacob and his father go back to Delfzijl, and we see then Jacob throughout the war years and slightly after that. And what was interesting is that this boy blames the death of his brother not on the Germans but on the Dutch government because they flooded the city, and he also blames the RAF, the Allied forces, for other things that happened. So he sides with the Germans and he joins the German army, and more things happen. So it was really interesting to see his journey throughout this, how his ideas formed and then changed, and everything that happened with him. Parts of it didn't feel that authentic because he is this boy that is still very special. He's the one person that survives this. He's the one person that's able to do that. So that was too bad, but it did make his adventure very slightly epic. So I did appreciate it, kind of, but I really liked reading from another point of view than I had until now from the Second World War. So if you like historical fiction, this one is an okay one, yeah. Then I've got a Dutch book, but this one was translated and is well known at the minute. It's De Avond is Ongemak by Marieke Lucas Rijnveld, and it is currently shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, and the English title is The Discomfort of Evening. And it's about a young girl, Jas, who lives in a Reformated family in a farm in the Netherlands, and one winter she's angry at her brother because he's allowed to go ice skating and she isn't. And at the same time, she's very afraid that her father is going to kill her bunny because Christmas is advancing, and she's seen her father a few times near the rabbit hutch, and he usually doesn't go there. So this 10-year-old girl prays to God that God takes her brother and not her bunny. And as you can imagine, that particular moment God was listening, and her brother has an accident, gets trapped under the ice and dies, and her bunny of course survives. So we've got the setting of this family. We've got father, mother, Jas's elder brother, and she's also got a younger sister, and all of them grieve in their very own ways, and we read about that throughout a couple of years. Now, what makes this book special is the writing. This was exactly how I imagined grief could feel, because everything is very raw, but at the same time, everything is still in a daze. So emotions are harsh, but they still feel as if there's mist somehow. Not everything comes in, but what does is very hurtful. So she describes very gutting things, like, for example, her father often just walks away because he can't cope with anything and they don't know if he's going to come back. Her mother frequently talks of suicide. Her older brother is randomly killing all sorts of animals. She also describes how she's constipated and how the family deals with that. And we've got graphic scenes, and big parts of it is also her becoming aware of sex and sexuality and what happens around that. And we've got talk about mud and talk about excrements. It's very, very raw, and I think this is definitely not a book that everybody will like because of the writing, because it's very uncomfortable to read at some points. And for me, that was also part of what I liked. It was getting goosebumps because of the disgusting things that are described, but that were very part of this girl's life. And I think also one of the things that made me also very like it a lot, was that I somehow recognized the context. Now, I am not Dutch. I wasn't raised in a Dutch farm, nor any farm for that matter. But my boyfriend was, and so I've been in his house now, and lots of this was how I imagined his youth to be. So I could see the breakfast table, and Marike Lucas Reinfeldt is 1 month older than me, and they reference events that also were happening when I was a child. So they also lost their brother when they were young. So I think the parts that were about grief were very palpable because of that experience. But Jas in the book looks at the Sinterklaasjournaal, which is the thing that all kids look at when they're young. So that was very recognizable. So if you like raw books and want to get out of your comfort zone, this is definitely a book that you should read. Be prepared to be disgusted, is what I will say, though. Next, I've got 2 books that were not translated. So if you are purely looking at this video trying to get recommendations and you don't read in Dutch, then bye-bye. For the other ones, I want to talk about this book, Zij namen het woord, by Margot Dijkgraaf. This is a non-fiction, and in this, Margot Dijkgraaf talks about the lives, the work, and the impact of the work of 10 French female writers between the 17th and the 10th century. And these female writers, I'm going to tell you all of them, their names. We've got Madame de Sévigné, Madame de Staël, George Sand, Colette, Nathalie Sarraute, Simone de Beauvoir, Françoise Sagan, Maryse Condé, Annie Ernaux, and Lydie Salvaire. Salvaire. And she writes this, this would translate to They Took the Word. So the idea is that she talks about their lives and what made these women badass and what they brought the French literature. I'm not going to talk about all of these writers. I didn't know most of them, so I was happy to get some kind of an introduction. And the ones I found most badass were Madame de Staël, because she was a very worldly woman. Sorry for the background noises, by the way. She was a very worldly woman, and she wrote a book about Germany and about Romanticism in Germany. That was a movement that was coming up. And Napoleon III did not like that. So he banished her to her poor little castle in the east of France. And Madame de Staël was not having any of it. And she ran away multiple times from her castle. And she was going all over Europe. She even met the Tsar. And she also went all around France to go to Britain and have her book published there so they could then infiltrate France and people would still get to read it. So she was pretty badass, and I'm looking forward to reading that book about German Romanticism. And the other author that I was really intrigued by was Maryse de Condé. She is a lot more recent and also got the Nobel Prize for Literature at one point, and she was born in the Guadeloupe in the Caribbean and in a very privileged family who never talked about the slavery past. And Maryse de Condé when she went to France in her late teens, I believe, that was the first time that she was learned about what happened and slavery, and it was also the first time that she was discriminated against. So she didn't feel very at home in France. She realized that her life in Guadeloupe was also very one-sided, and for a lot of black people at that time, apparently one of the things was, well, you should just go back to Africa because that's where you're from and you'll find your roots there. So she moved to Africa with her husband. She lived in La Guinée and in Ghana also at one point, but she couldn't earth there at all either. She still felt very much like an outsider, and people said, well, you're not Africa, you're not from here. So she struggled a lot with this theme of where do you belong, which is a theme I find very interesting. So I'm looking forward to reading more from her, well, anything from her basically, because now I've only learned a bit about her life. So she was also very cool, but the other women also still had, they were still badasses, but what struck me is that a lot of them, whilst being badass, they weren't fighting for feminist rights, because, well, that was something that women weren't ready for. So when women were educated, then it would make sense to fight for their rights, but now they weren't ready. But at the same time, they would still benefit from being educated. So they would not give other women the rights that they themselves had and weren't fighting for it. So it was kind of weird. About the book itself, because I was happy to learn about this author, but the book itself I was not happy with at all, because as you can see, it's not that big. It's 270 pages, so we've got 10 authors. So if you take away the introduction and the bit at the end, and every time we've got also a list of further reading, and we've got a picture. This is Maryse Condé, by the way. So that takes away a lot, and a list of quotes. So we've got max 25 pages per author, so you can't do a lot in that. So when you don't have a lot of space, it's important to be concise. It's important to have priorities, and it's important to be structured, and I did not feel this was that at all. Sometimes she would start with an author's life, sometimes she would start with her own experience with that author, whilst I think it's in the third author that she just randomly starts with 2 pages talking about her own experience reading that author, whilst she hadn't talked about her experience with the previous authors that she described. So that felt very weird. And there were a lot of little things like that. There's one point she manages to repeat herself. She talks about one author in relation to another, and then when the next author comes, she kind of says the same sentence, but I mean, it was 30 pages before. I can remember that. And what I disliked most was that she didn't talk enough, in my opinion, about the impact that these women had on the times and on literature in French as a whole. She did it for a few, but she still just scrapes the surface. And it could have gone a lot deeper. If you're concise and if you don't repeat parts of the author's story, then you can still do that in the pages that you have. In her defense, she wrote this book in, I think, just 2 months, because in the Netherlands we've got a book week, yearly book week, and this year the theme was rebels. So she wrote this book to fit in that theme and to be sold at the time. So it was written in a very short time, but you can really feel that it's also not edited very well. So I was very disappointed in this book. As I've said already a couple of times, if you're looking for an introduction to these authors, there are probably books that do it better. Honestly, I think Wikipedia structures it even better. And if you're looking for a book that gives you more depth, then this is not it either. But the women were cool, so we've got that. And tomorrow, or the day afterwards, I'm going to get a beep load of French books, especially from Maryse Condé, and I've got a few that my mother gave to me, but I had to leave in the Netherlands, so there's that. Then we've got the last book, which is also a non-fiction and is even more Dutch than the previous books. And it's called Het Recht van het Snelste by Thalia Verkade and Marco Brommelstroet. This was not a disappointment at all, and it's about traffic. You might think that is not a sexy topic at all, but it was so interesting. And also I've studied a bit how to design traffic, so I was already slightly interested. But still, this was very interesting. The book describes, through the eyes of Thalia, who is a journalist, how we see traffic, design traffic, and what the priorities are in Dutch traffic, how they came to being, and what the systematic decisions are that designers but also people make, and the systematic judgments that we all have. And all of that is based around the fact that the car is a norm, whilst the car hasn't really been on our streets for that long, and a lot of decisions, when you look at it through different eyes, don't necessarily make sense. So for example, she talks about how in residential areas it doesn't necessarily make sense that pedestrians and bicycles, you've got a lot of bicycles in the Netherlands, aren't given priority over cars. They have to adapt to cars. We have to teach young children that they aren't allowed to play on the street in front of their house where their parents can look at them playing because cars might pass. We have to build special areas for kids to play because they can't play on the street. And the book also talks about how less and less kids can go to school on their own because the crossings are very dangerous. There are, in some cases, no lights and not even pedestrian crossings because they have to cross busy roads, and the most important thing now is flow and being able to go fast and not the safety of kids or them learning to become independent. So that was interesting. It touched on many, many interesting points. It also describes the situation in the past and how we came to this and the associations that fought for the rights of the pedestrians and for the reasons that we have a lot of bikes in the Netherlands. It also talks about things in other countries and sociological views on traffic, and the influence of language also was very interesting. For example, the term jaywalking was introduced so that people could say that jaywalking is not allowed. You can't, as a pedestrian, cross over anywhere you want in the street because cars are king. Whereas before that, the streets were the regions where pedestrians were allowed to move because there were no cars. And by introducing the term jaywalking, that became something you weren't allowed to do. And it became a way to appropriate the streets, to give the streets to the car. So there's a lot of information like that, and it was really, really interesting. So if you want to learn more about what moves us to move in the way that we do, I'd highly recommend this book. As I said, it's mostly about the Netherlands, but it's written in Dutch anyway, so if you don't speak that language, I'm sorry, but you won't be able to read it. So those were the 5 books that I've read in the past 2 weeks, because I missed last week because I was in France but cycling the whole day. I will see you on Friday. Thank you for watching. I'd be curious if you've read any of these books, especially De Avond is Ongemakken, and what you thought of that. More people should read this because it's good. Anyway, see you next time. Bye!